face the day with optimism. I'm kind of looking around to see if I'm seeing any heads nodding. In reality, this is really not a conscious decision that we make. But I would like to think that most of us, nonetheless, are optimistic. I mean, we should be because we live here. We live in a land where life is so good that we have the luxury of taking things for granted. Likely, this morning when you woke up, your furnace had been operating, and so the room was at a comfortable room temperature. And if it was dark like it was when I got out of bed this morning, you could reach out and flip a light switch and bring light to your house so you didn't trip over either items that your children, your grandchildren, your spouse or friend left laying around so you didn't end up getting injured. And then you walk into what we call our restroom or bathroom, and you actually had running water. Then you got to an automobile and drove to church. And you were pretty confident that this microphone and the sound system we have was going to be working. Things we take for granted. At least until they don't work. Then we might not take it for granted once they don't work. For instance, if your alarm doesn't go off in the morning. You've had a power outage, your alarm doesn't go off in the morning, and you end up being late to work. Or how about if your furnace failed during the night and you wake up shivering because you're cold? Or again, a power outage and the light switch isn't responsive. I've done that a few times when powers went out, and come home and not be able to get to my garage because I have no electricity. I don't have a manual system, so I slept in the car for a couple hours waiting for them to get things back going again. We panic a little bit. We get really frustrated. We think, this is not how my day's supposed to be. My life is supposed to play out in such a way so that I am comfortable all the time. Huh? So what happened this morning, man? Somebody must have flipped this script on me because that's not the way it is. Now, while we may live that way, most of the rest of the world has a completely different script anyhow. I mean, a minor power outage that I've kind of described here with some examples is a minor thing in many nations. I mean, in fact, outside of our own country, or maybe outside of the neighborhood in which we live, there are problems and concerns that we can't even comprehend. There are illnesses that simply can't be treated. There are people dying because they are hungry. There's political and civil unrest over exploitation of and abuse of humanity and of nature. In fact, in some places, a minor power outage would be a pretty good day. That would not be a bad thing. Yet many of us see the discomfort in power outages, in natural disasters like hurricanes or weather changes, and wars that are happening in distant places, and we interpret them as, gee, the end must be near. Something's going on here. The end is coming. If you don't believe what I'm saying, you're either being naive or you're not recalling back, because all you have to do is either listen to television or go through a grocery store line looking at the tabloids, because they are loaded with them. Huh? Some of you might remember we made that transition from 1999 to 2000. For months before that, there was a panic that all of the computers were going to lock up, right? And people were panicking, preparing for the end. I don't know this for a fact, but there could be people still out here in this audience that have water stockpile from that time, or that they weren't going to have any. So that's a possibility. And then if you follow other stories, the mining calendar theory is saying we're not going to have net New Year's resolutions this year because the end of the world is coming in December anyhow. Truth be told, throughout history, any numerous amount of disastrous events have come or been predicted and maybe had destruction along with them, but then have passed. Now, as we approach those, and if others approach them, tension builds up with us. Sometimes people pray. You never pray. People act a little bit nicer to each other sometimes even during those things. Go reach out to people when they never reach out to people at other times. But then, as soon as those doomsday things pass, everything goes back to normal. Everything goes back to normal. Our text this morning is chronologically situated toward the end of Jesus' ministry. After the bulk of his work in the Galilee is completed, and he finds himself in the metropolis area of Jerusalem. This is not a Thanksgiving lectionary choice that those people who choose lectionaries to make about a Thanksgiving sermon, I can tell you. Jerusalem, this metropolitan city, is the home of the religious and the social elites of that time, the haves of society. The scenes that precede this text speak of Jesus' ministry, his teaching, his cleansing the temple, his misunderstood words, his misinterpreted warnings, and right before the climax and mark of Jesus' capture, trial, and execution, we hear Jesus utter these apocalyptic words. I know we have all heard that word, the apocalypse, whether you watch the movie Apocalypse Now or some other type of thing. And so to clear up a little bit for you, I'll just take about a paragraph of space in my notes here to tell you kind of what apocalypse means in the setting of the Bible. Apocalypse is an unveiling, a revealing, or a vision that grants us or gives us a glimpse, if you will, into what's going on, but beyond that, to what's really going on. It speaks of what God is doing and what God will do. Now, most of humanity interprets that as some kind of mass destruction, or destruction period, or at least a warning of destruction. But I'm wondering if that's really what's going on. If you remember, the scripture opens up that Jesus and his disciples moved to the Temple of Jerusalem. This last week, to emphasize to you what this structure is like, I was at Christian Theological Seminary for a while, and I ran into retired seminary professors. And let me tell you right now, seminary professors don't really retire. Because I stood in the hall, basically getting lectures from them. They continue to say things. And one of them was talking about the temple in Jerusalem, about that grounds, about how massive that really was at that time. It was not a small place. It's kind of like the National Mall in Washington, D.C. You go to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and if you've not been there before, you see the picture and think, well, I'll just walk this to see all the statues. If you do, you've got an entire day encompassed because it's a huge place. Same thing here. This is a large physical structure. And it's a place where people who have been with Jesus out of the desert, walking around and stuff, would have come to this huge city with all these magnificent buildings, this brick and mortar that would have been magnificent, and they probably would have been in awe. No doubt that they asked Jesus, wow, look at these buildings. Look at these stones. They're magnificent. We get caught up in that same kind of hype, I think. You all know by now that I bicycle a lot. There's many times me and my wife are out bicycling that we're wandering through some subdivision with massive homes. And I usually tell my wife, I said, I must have fallen asleep in some college class because there's no way in the world I could live and afford to live in any of these homes. They're magnificent homes. They're beautiful. They're magnificent. And I'm sure that they too, the disciples, were doing that. It's also curious to me that here is Jesus making this announcement about the destruction of the temple, and here's a place that is important for the people of God, the temple, right? And what does Jesus do? He goes away from the temple over to the Mount of Olives. Notice Jesus wasn't in the temple. Could it be that God doesn't dwell in temples or / institutions? I think that's an interesting topic, mostly for another time, but I do have to share a few insights about that. Is, again, when we hear about the temple, and it certainly was important for the people of God, it's not where God called God's people in the first place. Anybody know where that was? Where God first called God's people to be with Him? On a mountain, right? Out in the deserts. It wasn't in that. And when the first temple was built, at some point the Babylonians came through and captured all the people of God and sent them off to refugee camps everywhere in the known world at that time. And what they do to the temple? They leveled it. And then eventually the second temple was built, which was in existence at the time that Jesus would have been walking the earth, where He would have went on that day in Jerusalem. But then about 70 A.D., the Romans said, we've had enough of these Jewish people, their nonsense, and what did they do? They leveled the temple. So for the most of the time that the people of God walked the face of the earth, they didn't have bricks and mortar as a place to be, a place that was specific for them. In fact, the early Christians worshipped in their homes or in catacombs, which I guess would be modern-day Starbucks, I don't know. But at least they weren't brick and mortar structures with that designated point of huge importance. And even today, some of us get caught up in those same ornate structures. Something for us modern and postmodern Christians to think about. Well, the disciples, nonetheless, wanted to know, they wanted the inside story about this destruction. And they've been walking with Jesus for 3 years. And literally walk. You can take a walk with folks. You can do a lot of conversation with taking a walk with folks, right? And so they've been walking for 3 years. You would have thought they'd have some insight as to what's going on here. They would have by this point known, hey, Jesus doesn't have any weapons of mass destruction, right? He has no ability to be able to drop these physical walls of this building. But it seems like maybe their thoughts are somehow distorted. Maybe it's distorted because of all the frills and the whistles and bangs they're seeing in Jerusalem from these bricks and mortars and these buildings. It's kind of like, anybody been to a play lately? Yeah. If you've been to a play lately, they have painted scenery. Right, Russ? You're involved in plays all the time. Is that real? Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm not saying these buildings weren't real, because they certainly were, but it might be that they were empty of God's Spirit. That they were of a cave. A tomb that was dead. Just didn't know they were dead. And we as human beings, and specifically Americans, kind of get caught up in the hype of all those type of things. We always have that lingering about us that someone else is going to tell us what we need and what will satisfy us, even if there's a hollow shell there to do it. For instance, two of the biggest industries in the United States are diet books and exercise books and things. They make a small fortune through those things. One of my sons last year bought for another one of my sons a thing called a shaker weight. It's a bar that has weights on the end that's like got some kind of spring. So you sit there and shake it like this. That would make you fit and lose weight. I mean, it's a ridiculous concept. They sold thousands and thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of those things because somebody told them that that would work. We also spend all kind of money going broke or being depressed because we can't get there with other things we do because someone, either on television or a magazine, says, here is what will bring you satisfaction and happiness with that. I know that very firsthand because one of my sons owns a company that works for takes care of foreclosed homes that people have purchased. And the vast majority of those foreclosed homes are people who couldn't really afford a home in the first place and bought more home than they could because that was what they were supposed to have because somebody told them that's what they're supposed to have. And so they bought 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a 3-car garage, you know, way over their budget, and then all of a sudden, oh, we can't afford this. Which is good for Ben because it makes his living, but it's not good discernment as a human being. And so oftentimes, because of those ornate masonry, I'll say, as a generalization about all these things in our lives, we end up empty with pain and disappointment. I notice that thematically, not only in the Bible, but also in the world in which I live, most of the conversations I hear about these topics about the end, the storyline, is by people who have, and not the people who are the have-nots. You see, the people who live on the margins of society, who are politically, religiously, spiritually beaten down, they're not worried about whether or not the end is coming. They're worried about justice, about equality, and about peace. They're really wanting to hear some good news. Those who are the haves, however, what they're trying to do is maintain the status quo so they can maintain what it is they have. That facade that everything is right even when it's not. Instead of being concerned about the liberating good news of Jesus Christ, they're more interested in embracing that God of consumerism. I mean, we even have churches around that do that they're hard to differentiate from some sophisticated social club or cultural association or business in the way they specialize about the way they go about their work and their well-being. While the poor, the outcast, the abused, the left out are put out, ignored, or even further oppressed. Jesus was well aware of that scene because he had been in Jerusalem, where only special people could move to special parts of the temple, and only special people could do special things, the haves, while the have-nots were pushed way out. Might have been why Jesus went to the hill to get away from that. And he talks to his disciples and tells them that these things are going to happen. There are going to be people that are going to not have. There are going to be disasters. There are going to be wars. All those things are real. They're going to happen. But you need to make sure that you don't get caught up in the danger of the status quo like these folks did. Don't try to isolate yourself for the survival of your own salvation by forgetting about community. In that type of mindset, I think Jesus would probably say that when you read about the rise of homelessness, of babies being abused, the plight of the poor, your responsibility for those communities would not be one to try to transform them, but be one instead that we would want to ignore all that violence, pain, and abuse, and destruction, and instead close the door, make it a safe place where I can work out my own soul salvation instead of engaging in the birth pangs of the transformation of our world. Jesus, I think, was clear about that. He was saying that this is not the end. This is the beginning. When you see all that pain in the world, it's not the end. These are opportunities. Tragedies are opportunities to transform yourself and transform the world around you and those systems that oppress and hurt others. Jesus' conversation about the destruction of the temple might well have been symbolic. He might not have had insight that the Romans were going to destroy that in 70 AD. It might have been simply that he was saying the systems and institutions that oppress and that exclude others need to end. And that status quo needs to end, and there needs to be new birthing, a transformation where people of God, who say they are people of God, work for justice and freedom and peace and transform life. This is not the end. Not today. This is the beginning. This is the Word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God.